All right, everybody. Thank you for hanging out for one more. We have Michael Butt, the head of product consulting for Amplitude, another sponsor. So good to have you up here. And we're going to talk about data and analytics. So with that, I wanted to start, how do you really feel like the world of software and product and digital has changed and evolved recently?
Yeah, I'd say that there are three kind of big arcing trends.
Might need to move that.
And really that are driving the need for more data analytics. One in the world of software is how integrated it is in our lives. Right? There's a recent MIT tech study that showed that we spend on average 200 minutes in digital products every day, which I think for many of us in the technology world is actually much higher, but still 200 minutes a day. And that's really shifted for us when we're building software to think about not just basic usage. And the term that we use at Amplitude is that it's not just page views anymore. It's really about how digital products are integrated into your lives. And then thinking about that from a product development perspective, and then being able to use analytics to understand that user behavior and how it's affecting people's lives. That's the first one, lives versus page views. Second one is just the general speed of adoption, how quickly a digital product can go viral. A good comparison would be if you look at the internet generally, it took 8 years for 100 million people to begin using the internet. And an extreme example, Pokemon Go had 100 million users in 3 days. So the adoption that can happen, which is both an opportunity and a threat, actually, that we all need to consider in terms of when we're building software. The third one that's related to that is the barrier to entry. It's so easy now to build a software product and release it out to the market and take advantage of that speed of adoption. And the success rate has just plummeted for digital products. 1 in 10,000 is often quoted as the rate of success now.
Yeah, I think they're saying 90% of startups fail, and the odds there. But you're right about the ease. If you look at all of the services that are now available, either with Google or Amazon, there is literally no barrier to entry. Somebody with a credit card and a reasonable balance can get started for nothing.
Yep. Yeah, a couple people in a coffee shop. Yep.
So I personally have been noticing a convergence in the market between product management and UX. I actually put the two departments together. I think that the skill set is now overlapping to a significant part, where you can't have a product manager who doesn't understand UX, and you can't have a UX designer who doesn't really get product. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So it's certainly a trend. I think what we're all talking about a lot in terms of iterative software development now, and trying to have a cross-functional design team that might be operating out of those iterative cycles that a build team is really working on is breaking down. It's not working, especially as those cycles become faster and as teams are becoming more data-driven. Those designers who might be operating in a different mental model and might not be in those feedback loops, it's just not working as well, and so it's breaking down. So we're seeing the trend toward designers being put within the build team itself, being part of those iterative cycles, and now starting to be more data-driven, whereas traditionally maybe you'd say that designers had been a little bit more on the opinionated side versus actually using data.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a huge advocate of data-driven design, so much so that my teams get a little irritated at me. I famously have said, if you don't have data to back it up, at best it's a guess, at worst it's an opinion. And so I've actually been taken to task about that on LinkedIn and public forums, as well as on the speaking circuit, where people believe that intuition is still valid and that intuition is required. How do you sort of see the balance between the need for data-driven decisions versus intuition that designer might think that they have?
I think they can go together. And we talk a lot at Amplitude about the need for both the qualitative and the quantitative and when they're appropriate and when they can work together. There are pitfalls and downfalls to using data. It's not perfect. It can also be used in ways that can lead you astray. When you can use it properly, it can be an excellent tool and an excellent guide. But there are lots of situations, and if you look at design thinking generally, when you're trying to really empathize and come up with, you don't have a clear problem definition, there are times when basic intuition is a good way to go and a good way to start. But what you want to do, as soon as you can, as soon as possible, is get into that iterative cycle, classically in the lean method, where you're build, measure, learn. And that measurement and learning, you want to be able to do that as quickly as possible if you are starting with gut or intuition as a way to kick off a project.
So you start, you gather some data, you then make decisions based on the data, but it's a genesis. And one thing we were talking about the other day that struck me, and I probably had not thought of this myself, is that with iteration comes a changing of metrics, and that sounds weird to a lot of people, like the notion that the KPIs that you create or the data that you use or what you look at on a day-to-day basis as you're building your product changes. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And I think this comes from the classic approach to analytics and even business intelligence generally, is that you can know up front everything that you need to measure and report on, and if you just set that up, that you're going to be good to go. But to really run experiments well, to be testing well, it's really about the hypothesis that you're building. And the hypothesis that you're coming up with then really needs to have the appropriate set of data for you to then learn what you need to learn on the other end. And you can't possibly measure everything up front. You can try, but you're probably going to end up with a lot of data you won't be able to use. And so you really have to look at your hypothesis building process and knowing what's the data you're going to need on the other end to really help you to validate or disprove that hypothesis. And that means becoming agile with your data collection methods as well.
And does that come with a cost? Because it seems like you're either going to have to change your analytics or add storage or impact the feature roadmap, right? Because if you need to change your metrics and you need to change the data, features suffer.
Absolutely. There is a cost to it. There's an engineering cost to it. There's a design and just a thinking cost to it. But the benefit is you can be more data driven in a way that is in the iterative world, that you are learning quicker, faster. And if you really believe that, if you really believe that the way to get to an answer most efficiently is going to be through experimentation and iteration, then it's a low cost to pay.
I had talked with one of the previous speakers, Emily, about the need to build a research culture. If you want to start doing research as part of product, you actually have to build the culture that supports that. It sounds like you're going to need the same with data-driven design. How can people get started, right? If they believe us that data are the right way to go, how do they go about getting started building a data culture in their companies?
Yeah, and this is challenging. I'll start with, you have to look at where your company is and how your company operates and what the company values overall. Jonathan, you and I talked a bit about being in a feature factory, that if that's really what you're measured on in terms of output, it can be difficult to then try to shift to a learning culture. And you may need to start with a pilot project, maybe start small, maybe find a way that you can introduce this in something that won't upset the apple cart and how things are done, But it really does start and end with that learning culture and being able to instill that into the belief that that's the best way to get to the right answer, is through learning. And part of that means you have to be okay with failure. You have to be okay with an experiment that doesn't come out with the results that you expected, and that is a learning opportunity, just like when you run an experiment and the results are maybe proving your hypothesis correct.
Yeah, and I think the notion of learning is something that we're continuing hearing, as well as intellectual honesty, right? The companies just have to be ready for it. They have to be ready to be swayed not by opinion, not by the noise in the room, and instead other things, which, I mean, technically this is software development, which is computer science, and science should be based on fact, not opinion. So we should be able to get there for sure. But so let's say people do get started with data and they're collecting and they're measuring and they're iterating based on it. What are some of the traps about going down the data-driven path?
Sure, sure. I mean, I mentioned a couple of these just quickly earlier, but one of the, I think the biggest pitfalls is to think that you need to collect everything in order for, to be data-driven and to use analytics well. Trying to collect everything, one, it's not feasible, just from a cost perspective, and you're really not going to be able to use it on the other end. So that's one of the biggest pitfalls, and it feels like that had been a trend a few years ago, and some people are still trying to do it.
Look, digital hoarding is a very, very real thing.
Absolutely.
I worked with a company that had what they called an unapologetic data strategy. They would store it all and let the engineers figure it out. It's a dysfunction. I think it's probably not good, but it's a real thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the other maybe pitfall, is thinking that you'll be able to make sense out of your data on the back end, on it afterward. That if and that's why being hypothesis driven in terms of then the data you're going to collect and knowing its usefulness ahead of time, thinking that you're just going to collect it and then know what to do with it afterward, even if you're past the collect everything, but you're just going to start dumping data somewhere and then hope that it'll be useful. You really should think about your data strategy a little bit more and how it's going to be used and really have a purpose for it. And so I'd say that's pitfall number 2, is thinking that you're just going to be able to sort it out on the back end.
I've seen one other problem in companies, which is the weaponization of data. And sort of, I was at a conference years ago where somebody said the data never lie, but the data can be uncomfortable. And seeing departments use data against each other is a bit of a misstep that I see a lot of organizations going into.
Yeah, and there are kind of 2 aspects to that, right? There's one is believing that data is infallible, and that's not the case. It can be. But 2, it really points back to a lot of what we're talking about here is having this culture of learning. And if you have a culture of learning, and if really what you're trying to do is iterate and learn, and you're running experiments to test hypotheses, the data is going to line up with those hypotheses that you've generated. And you're pretty much going to know ahead of time, based on what the data shows you on the other end of the experiment, how you're going to learn. And there's a lot less room for interpretation there and weaponization of the data when you've been clear about the hypothesis and the experiment you're running and what it is you want the data to tell you on the other end. And this is again, it's a very different way to go about using data versus let's do monthly reporting and then go try to interpret what that is. Monthly reporting is not an experiment-driven iterative process necessarily, and there's a lot more room then to explain away why the same set of data has changed month over month versus an experiment-driven process. And
how do you get hypotheses created? Because I think, if I think back to elementary school when I learned about science, that, it's structured thinking. And, computer scientists and data people tend to think in structured ways, but a lot of data is used by sales and marketing. And they're typically more creative and free thinking. How do you collaborate with them to design good tests and to create good hypotheses to get good data?
Well, yeah, and this is a little bit of chicken and the egg. If you're going to use data to drive your hypothesis, which is one thing you can do, post-experiment, you've got the result for the hypothesis that you generated, but then you get to go explore and see what else you can build off of from that learning. But there is the other approach, which is, we talked before about using your intuition and using your gut. And that's where, trying to really crowdsource as much of the intuition and knowledge from the subject matter experts to build that initial hypothesis can be really valuable, and can also build that cross-functional mentality that what we're going to do is run a test, run a hypothesis. We're going to all know what we're doing here and why we're doing it. So then when we get to the results, we can all learn.
And what sort of time cycle do you think these iterations and these experiments should have? There's an irony talking about the speed of adoption of Pokemon Go.
Yeah.
3 days. And we're used to that rate, right? If you think about it, it took the internet 8 years to sort of get that number of users. People were used to long studies back then. They were used to long running, deep, thoughtful experiments, and in this digital age, it's fast and now. How do you see those experiments running? How long should they be? How long should it take you to come up with it? And how long should it take to run?
Yeah, there's a huge it depends here, of course. You know, and you have to look at what are the outcomes that you're trying to really achieve ultimately, why you're even running the test. And part of that outcome should tell you within the organization you're in, you know, how valuable this experiment is going to be, which can also drive then really how much resources do you need to put behind it. Now, you know, the quicker that you can run, generally the better, as long as you can get to a quality result. And that quality result is really, I think, you know, the important thing to be considering when then you're looking at the time frame that you're going to run. And there may be constraints in terms of you need to collect a certain amount of data from a certain number of users, and you're not going to get that for, you know, X amount of time, and so that'll be a limiting factor for how quickly you can move. But I do think that, you know, looking at overall, what's the outcome that you're driving toward? What's this experiment? How valuable is it? How quickly can you learn on a small scale? And if there is learning that can be done, trying to do that is almost always best. But ultimately, what you need is that valuable output from the experiment, and then engaging your time frame accordingly. And
who do you think should be involved in determining that outcome? Right? Is it a product manager? Should it be a collaboration? I mean, how many minds or how much buy-in do you need for the hypothesis and the outcome, and seeing that they're aligned?
And this is an interesting one, and I think that different organizations have different sort of cultures in how they're going to work there. An empowered product manager, it's fantastic when, you know, they are the product owner and they are really out there to be defining and running these experiments. And that's a lot of what we're seeing the trends toward. But that almost always requires that they have solid business context of what, or organizational context of what is important for a given quarter or given year or whatever it might be for the organization as a whole. And then they're empowered to distill that down into sets of experiments and hypotheses that can be generated to run to match up to those. One of the ways, many of you probably heard of the notion of a North Star metric, which can be really powerful. And really a North Star metric, it kind of assumes one for an entire organization. You could have it for a given product, you know, or even a given team. But one nice thing about having a North Star metric is it can provide context for any experiment that you run. And so you may be running an experiment that is looking at a certain user behavior that, you know, your goal is not to necessarily directly at that point in time with the experiment move that North Star metric. But you can at least have that in the context and see if it did move, then maybe what was the impact from the experiment that you just ran. And that can help to drive that empowerment down into the organization so that others can be more empowered to run their own experiments and develop those hypotheses focused on outcome, knowing it's in the context of metrics that are agreed upon for the organization.
Well, and it'll provide clarity, right? It provides, having North Star anything provides a level of clarity and certainty. And is the action that I'm about to perform or the spend that I'm about to engage in, is that in alignment with what we have all agreed is most important?
Yeah.
With anything. So I'm curious, and we probably have time for one, and then we need to move to the audience. Do you believe that data belongs in all parts of the organization? I'm seeing increasingly that the largest demands for data are in marketing, who just consume infinite amounts of information. Or do you think it's departmental, or do you think it needs to be organizational as a whole, like everybody's all in on a data-first strategy?
I wouldn't say you have to be all in on it. I think that when you can collect quality data and when you can institute a culture of learning through iteration and experiments, data is incredibly useful. Marketing is changing dramatically because it is needing to be less opinionated and more efficient fundamentally. And so marketing organizations are moving to being more hypothesis and experiment driven, with needing to measure the results more cleanly on the other end. So I think anywhere that you can instill that culture of learning and experimentation, take the approach of hypothesis building, knowing that you may or may not be right, and it's going to be okay either way. Data can be incredibly useful, but it's not required that the entire organization is bought in for an individual team to operate that way and become more efficient.
Perfect. I think the joke about marketing, 50% of my spend is right. I just don't know which 50%. They probably don't always like data-driven, because then they might lose 50% of their spend.
Absolutely.
With that, do we have any questions in the audience for Michael? Anyone want to know about getting started with data? Oh, perfect. We've got two. All right. We will get to you next, sir.
Thanks. One thing you mentioned was about, these decisions are easy if you have quality data. Can you talk a little bit more about, how do you define quality data, and how do you sort of set that up within your organization?
Yeah, and this is a critically important point, and it comes back to something we were talking about earlier, just your data strategy generally, and really understanding that you are going to collect the data that you need for your experiments to run well, and not just collecting data and hope that you can make sense of it afterward. This comes back to being intentional about your hypothesis building. And in the course of building your hypothesis, you have to ask yourself, what am I going to need to know on the other end of this experiment to have confidence in my hypothesis being, correct or incorrect? And then it is about working with the team generally, including whomever is going to be using those results on the other end, and making sure that they feel that they are getting the data that they're going to need if they have a different perspective on it as well. And so data strategy is critical when it comes to having that quality data, and not just going into a collect it, we'll sort it out later kind of mode.
I'd chime in that quality data is always important. When you think, I was talking about this with some folks a little earlier today, when you think about machine learning and AI type applications, data science, 80% of a data scientist's job is cleaning data. Now, if these guys and gals are getting paid hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per year, you probably don't want to spend 88% of that on cleaning up data. And so making sure that you're storing things properly, clearly, and is essential.
Yeah, and data scientists do spend an extraordinary amount of time, because the data collection strategy has just been grab it and dump it into a data warehouse, we'll sort it out later.
And developing hypotheses and thinking about your KPIs, from a product standpoint, there's a lot of variables that can go into the outcome of the data. How do you distill that down, or get to the level where you're able to identify changes or features that you're implementing from a product standpoint impact the data?
Well, this does come down to having a framework for what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, and thinking about what it is for those features that you're really driving toward. We have a model that we talk about at Amplitude. We call them engagement games. And we basically say that for pretty much any digital product, you are either vying for attention, transactions, or some sort of productivity that you're trying to drive. And so I think it's really important to have that framing for your organization of really what's the purpose of this digital product, and then what are we ultimately driving toward, and then building your metrics from that sort of a framework. And then it can look very different in terms of the behaviors that you're looking for your users to exhibit, and then that can drive the metrics that you're going to collect that will then be very specific to the experiment you're running. But maybe you have something more specific that you were thinking about, that maybe an example we could run through if that.
No, I think that really helps, because the two types of metrics that we try to measure are what is our impact to revenue, bottom line, and then what is our impact to operational efficiency. There's a lot of variables. We're not a manufacturing plant that has these set processes, so there's a lot of things that go into, one, our operational efficiency, and two, our revenue.
Yeah.
So I think hearing a little bit about that, what you said, helps.
Yeah, and that just helps to frame your experiment generally, right? And those sort of North Star metrics that you might have ultimately, what you may or may not be moving those with the individual experiments you're running, but you can, or maybe they will, ultimately when you get done with your experiment. But having the framing of what it is that you're driving toward and why this experiment is being run, and then there can be actually a layer of hypothesis there of how that's going to drive ultimately outcome for revenue, I think is really important to develop that framework.
Well, great. Look, thank you everybody for coming out. Again, data-driven design is an awesome thing. So are analytics. So is Michael Butt. So thank you very much, everybody. Can we have a round of applause for him?